Hello, our conversation this evening comes from Jessica Mann, the crime writer, Peter Isaac, the author, Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University, and Milton Shulman, drama critic of The Standard. We have music from Instant Sunshine. Something we may have overlooked in our homily about milk last week. Have we ever wondered, asks David Green of New Malden, Surrey, whether we were properly weaned off the stuff? Has it never occurred to you, he says, how peculiarly unnatural it is that fully grown people should still feed upon a product, and a surrogate one at that, which their bodies cease to need at 6 months? He may have a point there. Then I just have a late letter. It came racing into the studio just as we arrived in a cleft stick from Linda Burniston of Rochdale. Says, I would remind people that Laurie Taylor was talking last week about the great days when he was the milk monitor. Days of power, as Linda Burniston speaks of them. I should have thought he would have kept a low profile during this subject, for fear of revealing the nature of his proper job. The one at York is just a smokescreen. Every day, while travelling to work in Oldham, when I pass through Royton, I see a blue and white milk float, and on the front of this vehicle is a name board that says, Laurie Taylor, agent for Express Dairy. But if he actually was doing it, Linda, I think he'd put a false name on it, wouldn't he? Because it might be a cover for other, less reputable activities. I don't know what he thinks.
We're carrying a rather interesting blackcurrant yoghurt this week, actually.
Well, we mustn't advertise. We come to the question of school milk, which played a large part in our discussions last week. Someone said it came in half-pint bottles. May have been me, I think. But a lynx-eyed listener, Anne Mukes of Lewis, says, wasn't it thirds of a pint? I showed her a letter to my wife, who cried yes, and it still is. But Anne Mukes goes deeper. Those cardboard tops, she says, touching on one of the great historical totems we made the subject of this programme years ago, when the centre had been pushed out, Miss, she says, required them to be collected, and when they'd finally become sour-smelling roundels scuffed at the edges, we were forced to weave multicoloured raffia round them. In time, many hundreds of these were accumulated in an old biscuit tin, only to be then joined to make table mats. For whom, I ask myself, she then concludes. Well, who knows, perhaps to send to old milkmen out at pasture. But in between tatting your own table mats this week, Laurie, you've been studying the Queen and the film stars.
Yes, indeed. The sight of the Queen shaking hands with all those Hollywood stars of yesteryear, it's apart from reviving my notion of a regular publication to supplement Who's Who and Who Was Who, a new publication entitled Who's Who But You Thought Were Who Was Who, it also reminded me that much of my abiding sense of intellectual doubt, the feeling there can be no true and certain knowledge in the whole world, comes from that golden cinematic moment in the film Caesar and Cleopatra, where Stuart Granger, as Apollodorus, or was it Apollinaris, hurls off his cloak and dives 25,000 feet from the battlements of a castle into the water below. Now, the point about this is that as far as my 12-year-old neighbour in Streatley, Mavis Whitehouse, was concerned, this was the piece of acting that settled for once and for all that Stuart Granger was the best film actor in the world, while I, with what I've got to admit now was the first of a series of misunderstandings of how to be a proper film fan, had to admit it did cast very, very serious doubts indeed on my own 11-year-old certainty that the absolute bestest film star in the whole of the world, universe, planets was James Mason. Now, I'm not quite certain how I came to fall in love with James Mason. Why it was that I didn't, like all the other spotty onanists at junior school, fall for Veronica Lake. I can only think that my parents had once spoken well of him, and that therefore he'd been adopted as best alongside Joseph Locke, Freddie Griswood, and radio plays produced, I think, by Martin C. Webster. But as it turned out, I was no better as a film star idolater when I grew up and got a steady job. I fell in love all right, and this time it was with a woman. I sat in the rear stalls, and I longed to be with the cinemascopic goddess on the screen, who just occasionally, I could swear it, she glanced directly at me, so much so that I even at times wanted her to look elsewhere, to stop making our relationship so obvious. The feeling was all right, I was definitely a fan, but the object of my intensity was still wrong. While others were cultivating Anouk Aimée and Valley and Monica Vitti and even Marilyn Monroe, I was desperately in love. Just the way she spoke, she moved, and particularly the way she just touched her hair, with Elkie Summer. Well, as I expected, most of you look completely puzzled, but then you're all dying to tell me about your own identifications and worship and much more appropriate affairs with Lauren Bacall and Ingrid Bergman and Claudette Colbert.
It was the slobs that really attached me. I suppose I was early riveted by Errol Flynn and his great war cry, "Let's put out the lights and get naked." And after that I think it was Robert Mitchum, if I quote the great man well, once went to a fancy dress party dressed as a hamburger. That's to say, he was completely naked and he'd poured tomato sauce on himself and he'd put buns back in front of him. What an excellent man. He was the one who said that the only thing wrong with being on the big silver screen was you had to be there, you couldn't telephone the performance in. He was a great man. I once met him and I said rather fervently, "Who first indicated to you, Mr. Mitchum, that you were an actor?" And he just said, "Me mother," and walked off in a sort of pall of silence. Loved them all.
What sort of that was real at the time? You would go and see Robert Mitchum films because because my other equivalent after Mason, I fell in love with Richard Widmark was the other person, particularly when he did A Psychopathic Laugh.
Yeah.
If you remember that, he had a funny little I can't.
You can't do it because I had a feeling to do it. He'd had all his teeth specially loosened.
Yes.
And then there was dear Victor Mature, who once, I sound like the man who used to sign his column. He knows them all. But I once, when I was about a boy, as it were, met these people. And he said, well, his mother, he said, was just all she wanted was for him to play a part where he got to wear a tie. I mustn't go on. It's such an enthusiastic vein.
I was terribly lucky because I was evacuated to Hollywood as a little boy,
but you never made it.
No, I couldn't stand in front of a camera for the life of me.
You've got a passing likeness to Freddie Bartholomew. No?
And when I got there, they all mentioned it because then I had very curly hair. It was a long time ago. It's all gone now, but it was awful. And because every old lady that saw me used to go and put their hands, kind of wriggle their hands through my hair and say, "Isn't he like Freddie Bartholomew?" But in fact, in that vein, when I arrived as an evacuee in the States, we arrived on the Scythia, a great big liner, just at the beginning of the war. Torpedoes had been kind of shooting round the thing, etc. And my most frightening event that ever happened was that a line of ladies, of Hollywood agents' wives, in New York Harbor, arrived. As the gangplank went down, they charged up it with mink coats on and Red Cross aprons on over their mink coats and very, very large amounts of lipstick, and they insisted on kissing us all. The point I was going to make very quickly was that most of the stars of that period that one seemed to meet, the Warner Brothers one in my case, one saw them as kind of mothers and fathers of nasty little children. Of course, they were rather boring and awful.
But you would never have been seized with the same enchantment. Your childhood was marred because the people had walked down from the large silver screen and actually into your life. Yes. I think that's what stopped film stars now being the magic, mystical things that they once were. Once upon a time, that big screen rather sort of significantly stuck up above you, and the faces and very large, was the only source of entertainment. Then comes along television with lots of little screens, and all the so-called stars, they're not called film stars now, they're called stars, are mixed in with quiz programs and news programs, and they're just common earth like ourselves, so there's no mystery anymore.
But the adulation of the stars is fantastic when you this kind of self-identification with them, and I imagine it must be hell to be a star. I think it was Charles Lawton. Said every time he went to a restaurant, he not only got soup, but an impression of Captain Bligh. And I'm sure that must happen to any man who does one particular little performance. And
as soon as you say it, I want to do it.
Jessica, were you a besotted film fan?
No, well, I went to films continuously. I think we called it going to the pictures, flicks or movies. I don't think we called
Flicks
it.
is well before your time.
Oh, is it? I remember the word. But I couldn't compete with you in remembering the names of all the film actors. You've all been listing the ones that played part in your childhood. Yes, okay, but the thing is, I don't think that I ever thought of them as individual people. I wouldn't have given a damn if I'd known they had feet of clay. It was the parts they were acting that I fell for, like Maximilian de Winter or Rhett Butler. I didn't care the names of the people who acted them. And also, I think that girls of my generation were rather hard done by for women. You've all mentioned men that you admired. And presumably what you admired about them was that they were the sort of people that you wanted to be, or at least they were playing parts of the sort of people you wanted to be. When I was a girl, there weren't any actresses like that. I mean, of course one wanted to be as beautiful and as sexy as they all were, and none of us managed it. But they were all playing parts of people who wanted to have things done to them and for them, not of people who wanted to do things themselves. And I suppose the jargon would be that they weren't giving us role models, but I think that's why I don't remember any of them.
You don't? What about Vivien Leigh?
Well, no, because she wasn't doing things herself except Scarlett O'Hara a bit.
She was very busy being Vivien Leigh, though.
Yes, I think the first part portrayed that really registered with people of a woman who was beautiful and clever and active was in the 1960s. I mean, like Honor Blackman in The Avengers, that sort of thing. I don't think there was anyone.
Oh, Vivien Leigh, I must speak of I just want to put you straight. I've spoken of Mitchum. You might get the wrong idea. The one I fell in love with at the age of 13 was Vivien Leigh.
What a relief to know.
Well, of course, I can see that look of concern passing across your otherwise unsullied brow. It was in Waterloo Road, a real weepy. And it grabbed me like no one's business. Later in life, but not very much. Oh, this was in Goole, in the Tower Cinema, but not very much later in life. A friend of mine, Trevor Breadnut, for the sake of libel laws, was dancing at a ball at Oxford with her. And he said the first time I saw you, Miss Leigh, I was 8 years old. Whereupon, for some reason, she stamped on his foot and walked off the floor. So she was real after all.
It's nice what Jessica said about the fact that you remembered the sort of Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara. I mean, for all I was concerned, Rhett Butler and Scarlett could be the name of film stars. I mean, they always seem to be sort of indistinguishable, because when we were sort of dirty boys and used to sort of know about those films which were supposed to be sexy, and the stars of those films seemed to me to stand. I mean, so when I knew about Jane Russell in The Outlaw, I mean, it just seemed to me that there was somebody called Jane Russell, and Rita Gabb. And
she was very lovely.
And Jennifer Jones. Now, those names, it didn't matter what part they played. If they came on and they said that their name was, Louise, whatever, one never noticed it because they just simply... And I just wanted to ask you about one other, because this is almost like, I mean, this program often has a sort of provides cathartic opportunities, but when I did used to go and watch the Tarzan. It was a series that I used to go and see at a little cinema. Milton can probably tell me.
On Saturday mornings.
Saturday morning, yes. Which nearly ruined my sex life, I think, for always, because there was a Jane in this who used to have a rather sort of skimpy skirt, and she was always getting terrible things. And it was very, very badly done. And the whole thing, it used to last a quarter of an hour, and then it would splurge off at the end of the reel in the advertisements or whatever it would come on. But, for years afterwards, I never felt that I could successfully manage a relationship with anyone unless they were dressed somewhat like Jane and unless there was a prowling alligator in the background.
But your point about... There were a lot of very beautiful girls who I remember and who I fell in love with. You haven't mentioned any of them. Janet Gaynor and Jean Tierney and Ida Lupino. I thought those were really exciting figures that I can remember. And I'm rather sad, actually, having seen The Queen in Hollywood. We now actually see all our heroes and heroines old. I think this is a rather sad development. I think it's a shock, actually, to see Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly hobbling about. I remember Fred Astaire, an agent, a talent scout, when he first saw Fred Astaire, he wrote, can't act, can't sing, slightly bald, can dance a little. But to see them now, I'm glad Greta Garbo retired. We never saw her as an old lady, that's one of the great benefits, I think, of people with a certain amount of humility about themselves.
Do you feel the same about actors who are actually more than sex symbols and actually acted? Because we must be the first generation that's been able to watch people on one evening, if we want to, aging. I mean, you watch Brief Encounter with the young Celia Johnson, and you then see a television play with the old Celia Johnson. I find this actually inexpressibly poignant, and I suppose that's what you feel about Fred Astaire. But
I think if you're going to be old on the screen, I think you have to do it with a certain dignity. I think like George Burns, for instance. I think he said, if I knew I was going to live so long at 82, I'd have taken better care of myself. And
no, he didn't. No, that was that was Eubie.
It was Eubie. It's something like George. But I love George Burns when he was being asked at this to do what he thought of Prince Philip. He said, "Oh, lovely man." He said, "I only wish he'd married my sister Goldie."
Well, Astaire, it's strange. Milton and you, Jessica, you mentioned Astaire. Again, dropping the names from my legitimate past. I ran into Astaire. You say he's hobbling about. Well, by George, he's been hobbling about. He was about 112 in 1956. And I ran across him and he was saying, about all those films with Ginger Rogers. This is the saddest thing, not the hobbling. He said they were dreadful. They were empty and meaningless and almost an affront to the people who were living at that particular time. He said, you go back. He said, you go back and look at them. I have to say, I have gone back and looked at them, and I do not agree with him.
People often say, oh, yes, I was in love with so-and-so at a particular age and that this and that. But whether or not we did identify, just to take that actual word, whether or not, there were people, throughout our lives who meant a great deal to us and who we thought we'd really rather want to be like. I wanted to be like Father Ramsbottom from Melling, who taught me to ride a horse and introduced me to the German prisoner of war, and I wanted to be like a man called Jerry Dawson. I wanted to be like those people. But I can't think that film stars were always really absent. Now, I'm certain for other people that they really did actually stand at the centre. They were never quite so close to me like that.
Well, they were probably quite magnetic, but you were talking you wanted to be like this person and that person. I think what I wanted was for fragments of myself to be like, you see, here I remember the names of the feature players. Donald Meek. Little walnut-faced man, but rather waggish with it. A man called Arthur Treacher, another man called Eric Blore, with a terrible undulant scowl on his face. Both of them used to play butlers. There was a man, his name eludes me, who always used to play artists with his hair very long, looked rather French, and I think it was in the film Hell's a Poppin'. He was called in a courtroom scene to sit down in the witness chair, and you know how people sit on the edge of it. Not him, with his baggy trousers and long hair, just slid his behind forward and his legs splayed out, and he put his... And we all roared. The little group, we always went in groups to the cinema. We roared because, in a way, all these people, we found fragments of ourselves in them. What we didn't want to be, however, was wholly them.
Yes, yeah, but there were not only fragments of yourself in them, but you actually... The view was that somehow or other, because they became stars, they were able to give of themselves in every conceivable direction other than their acting ability. In other words, they were constantly asked a question about politics, astronomy, archaeology, birth control, all these issues. You would always ask a star whenever they were interviewed. You probably have been in very many of these interviews when people were asked.
I hang my head, it's true.
Ask all these people who are not remotely equipped to answer these questions. Nevertheless, all their words are seriously taken down. And it was this book I've been reading about Bogart, written by a woman who had an affair with him, who was his hairdresser. And she apparently lived with him for 15 or 16 years, all through his marriages to Bacall and everything else. And what is interesting about that book, not only the amount of time spent on Bogart's toupee, which apparently was a great artistic creation, but the fact that he doesn't say one single word about politics. And I remember there was always a version that Bogart was a left-winger, that he was involved in the anti-McCarthy period, that somehow or other he had and when you get down to the kind of dialogue that the first time he met her, the romantic word he said to her, "You've got a great ass, old girl." This was the most romantic statement he made to her, this great hero of Bogart.
Let us get our songbirds to sum all this up. Roll it all up into a ball, make a pretty ditty out of it, and, well, they've done it already, goodness me. And what they call it is a great big Hollywood star.
She was a great big Hollywood star, and on the silvery screen she looked like 17. She had a great big Hollywood car, an open limousine and subtle tangerine. She liked the taste of caviar. With every wiggle she could muster up, blockbuster, she was big box office, a sensation, a smash hit that swept the nation, the toast of every bar. A great big Hollywood star. On the screen her ruby lips and her undulating hips were so tantalizing I would long for more. But when I met her in the flesh I found I looked at her afresh as she toppled from her bar stool to the floor. She was a great big Hollywood star. Her agent owned a part of her immortal art. He smoked a big Havana cigar. His 95% helped him to pay the rent. She was his priceless objet d'art. He preened and poured and fast to his blockbuster. She was big box office, a sensation, a smash hit that swept the nation, the toast of every bar. His great big Hollywood star on the screen in furs and furs, with her blonde peroxide curls, she could lead a young man down the path to sin. But when I met her face to face, my pulse did not exactly raise as she tried to fish her eyelash from her gin. She was a great big Hollywood star. Although she'd learned to act, the skill did not detract from what was not a large repertoire. She played a tambourine and had a dance routine with 7 veils and peekaboo bra. She had strong men all afluster up. Blockbuster, she was big box office a sensation, a smash hit that swept the nation, the toast of every bar. That great big Hollywood star, she never got an Oscar. That great big Hollywood star, boop boop be-doo.
I think they made sense of it, did Instant Sunshine, because there they were singing a great big Hollywood star. Now, I have to say something quite different. I was thinking of the trolley buses that grazed the tar macadam pastures of my childhood. Harmless red herbivores, making the characteristic patient whiffling noise of their species, gathering up the citizens of the suburb as uncomplainingly as elephants give children rides at the zoo. And I was trying to put a number. I almost said a name. I should think something like Basil or Douglas would have fitted, to the one that stopped, as it were, to water just past the level crossing and opposite the school. And in this anthropomorphic reverie, the number came back to me. It was a 604, and it took you to Malden and Kingston and Hampton Court. Very tall-seeming, amiable ruminants, they staggered along as though on large flat feet, and I thought of them going home, not to a depot, but to slumber in some natural geological burrow, say a large airy cave underneath Box Hill. Well, I turned into the London Transport Museum, and what I saw there made me laugh aloud, involuntarily, in such a way that people looked round at me. For there it was, the 604, one dating from the mid-30s, so that it was an actuarial certainty that my own behind had helped to wear the threads in the dim blue upholstery of that very bus. And when I stepped onto the platform, I wondered which of my own footsteps I was treading in, and whether the last time I jumped aboard I was 7 years old and we were taking our sandwiches to Hampton Court, or whether it was later and I was hunting down at Bentall's a pair of suede shoes on thick crepe soles, without which life would have lost much of its savour. Well, it was a curious feeling, walking through ghosts of yourself. I was doing that when I climbed up the stairs and I looked round the top deck, peering into a room that hadn't been changed for 40 years. I was expecting echoes, because I think the local transport of everyone's early days was something very personal, especially if you're of the generations that didn't have a car. It was this conviction that made me think of an outing, propose it, to the Transport Museum in the first place. But I didn't expect to run across my own particular time machine, now beached on a timeless shore, but unmistakably under my own number, 604. I know the rest of you all went there. I can't imagine that you had the same kind of particularity of experience.
I like your reference to the ruminants, because although trolley buses never meant quite the same, they always seemed to me rather like drunken trams, and a terrible hazard if you suspected that they were a tram and set off across the road, and suddenly they slewed across the corner and came off the tracks, as it were. But I remember exactly that feeling about that they were animals that went off to some, because in Liverpool, the trams, rather than the trolley buses, the trams were more rural and had been more rurified, is that a word? Ruralified.
It is now.
Yes. Than probably anywhere in the rest of the country. I never saw anything like this, because on the outskirts of Liverpool they had not only designed central reservations and turfed them over, and in the middle of these the trams ran, but there were trees to hide the trams, so that when you, as it were, stood and you looked along places like Queen's Drive to see if a tram was coming, you made out like a jungle shape which occasionally appeared between the trees until eventually it came into view, rather like one of those animals that you were describing. And so Liverpool was particular for that, and it was never the same in somewhere like Birmingham, where the trams were always very evident. The Regnal and Rubery trams, although they did have their central reservation, indeed achieved speeds that I was assured were over 100 miles an hour as they went past the Bourneville chocolate works on their way to Malvern. They never quite had that country appearance. How odd to think that trams were creatures of the country, which they were for me.
But what about the Underground, which went miles out into the country? In the same exhibition that you saw your trolleybus in, it was full of posters that I vaguely remember seeing on Underground platforms, and it seemed to me that they'd been designed by somebody who, as it happens, was an American, E. McKnight Coulfer. He seems to have actually believed the English myth that inside every town dweller there's a country cottager trying to get out. And he seems to... He advertised travelling on the Underground as though those tunnels under London magically would convey you to flowery fields.
But they did.
Well, not invariably to the flowery fields and the idealised landscapes of his pictures, especially not adorned with little couplets at the bottom of them. But they certainly had that effect on an urban child. I too was brought up in London like you, and I was actually convinced by this message, and I used to go out to Box Hill on a Green Line bus and yearn soulfully about the hedges. And I'm sure a lot of the reason for doing this was because I'd been taught by London Transport that that was what one was to do.
It's strange. Well, maybe I was. Maybe it's all hindsight, but I looked at the McKnight Coulfer pictures, and I thought they scarcely idealised the yearning for Rus in urbe, the yearning to sort of ruralise your surroundings, which was a particular feature of the suburbs of the 30s, because it was only a short while before that those suburbs weren't there, and the wild was pushing up underneath them. There was a picture in that exhibition of Morden, you may say, where's that? Well, it's more or less to the left of Switzerland, but it's there it was. The only thing there was a newly built tube station in this picture, and it looked exactly like a spaceship which had landed in the wild. The next picture to it, suddenly all the wild was covered in this brick and mortar, as though the spaceship had brought seeds in the shape of bricks which had proliferated like convolvulus over a wild, which in a curiously exciting way, I felt, but this may just be me, exists to this day underneath. And to see the Tar Macadam stripped back off it as it was in the first picture was curiously thrilling to me.
Because it was a whole new thing, public transport in that sense, suddenly at the beginning of the century, it all happened in 1898 or whenever it was, in a really big way. They produced all sorts of systems, and they had to have somewhere to take the people to. And so you found yourself with underground stations in the middle of the country because there was nowhere else to go to.
Absolutely.
And of course, the very essence of doing that actually ruined the country. I mean, because as soon as you have an underground station, the estate agents get in and say, hey, it's a marvellous place, direct underground contact, etc. But so I think it's one of the tragedies of this great, beautiful romanticism is that it's actually killed itself. I mean, I travel back and forth miles now. I travel as far as Ipswich, and then I drive further. And you know, for the first 40 minutes on the train, I see nothing beautiful and nothing that I can romanticize about. And it's really a great tragedy. And a lot of that is because in that period, everybody was moving out because we were told by these marvelous posters that it was a lovely Shangri-La beyond the next station, etc.
I think what you've got to look at is that because obviously underground stations without by themselves, without decorations, would be very dreary things to live in. So you have to, in some sort of way, make them attractive or make them exciting by posters. And I think the poster, both in the stations and in the trains themselves, have added a tremendous diversity. And the art of the poster, I think, has been very much developed through people like Kauffer, although I think that his particular versions of the countryside are rather kind and gentle and nostalgic.
When I used to see trams and buses, there didn't ever seem to be a suburb to places like Birmingham and Liverpool in the way there was to London. I don't remember when Jessica talks about being taught to go out, we didn't have an equivalent. You know, there wasn't a lesson about going out of those places. There was nothing which suggested that you went out. And the only going out was that on the side of the trams, when I confused, I think, when I was very young, the destinations with the advertisements, that so there were places like Colinos and Tyser and Bistow and Mackerson and those places which seemed to sort of like merge with the names of the places that the thing was going to. I mean, I knew that there were the real names and the numbers and the distinction about the place and going somewhere. And indeed, looking at those trams and buses when I was in that place this afternoon, I suddenly thought that what had happened, because trams and buses had decreased and were less popular, less people use them now, that we'd lost a whole range of place names. That because on the side of them it would say things like sort of, you know, that there was a little punch joke reproduced where the passenger says sixpence, why it's marked up as threepence. And the conductor's trying to explain. I mean, he's talking about the varieties of fares, rather like exist on British Rail at the moment. He says, well, yes, sir, threepence when you don't get in between Charing Cross and the Bank, or from Tuesdays to Mile End down the gate by Hungerford, or Edger Lane to Black Lion Lane, or Rathbone Place and Blackball Railway, or else you must go out to St Paul's Churchyard, or you can go to Pimlico all the way if you like. Beyond that distance, it's sixpence. Now, that roll call of names, some of which we know, but very few of which we use regularly, were stops, and you used to say, put me off at the Black Bull, put me down here. And I suddenly thought, that's changed, and now there are sort of districts and there are roads, but there aren't bus stops.
Yes, that's big. No, it hasn't changed. You've changed. I want to say you've grown up. You see, the thing is, the Southern Railway was my local. I mean, it was so local to me, the Southern Railway. It was like an extension of my front garden path. And when I was little, I would go to such places as, shall we say, Vauxhall or Earlsfield, and I thought they were ends in themselves. I thought they probably were places that lived in vacuum. I didn't think in these terms, but looking back I can see I felt that way. It was only comparatively late in life that I learned to understand how Vauxhall and Earlsfield screwed on to the rest of the universe. It was a most peculiar thing. You stopped at Rains Park, Malden, Effingham Junction, as though that was all there was in the wide world for the time being. The Southern Railway seemed to make a noise. I couldn't take the Southern Railway seriously. I thought because you just went to local places and came back, you left after breakfast and you perhaps came back before lunch, and it used to make a noise. The actual trains made a noise like spoons rattling in bowls of cereal, whereas you went on the LMS, which of course would go from Euston as far as Liverpool. There you've got a great deep burdoon, a great sumptuous noise, as of meals, very important grown-up meals, eaten away from home.
But the thing
it's just you've grown up.
If you've grown up to drive a car, and probably very seldom to travel in buses that give you these names anyway, because they do still. But the thing is that until you drive a car, you have absolutely no need to know what direction anything is in. You get into the bus and you say to Pimlico, please, and he says, OK, I'll tell you when it's Pimlico. You don't need to know if it's north, south, east, or west of where you started, or where you're going to go through to get to it. And one notices this abroad if one goes to a foreign town and uses entirely taxis and public transport and doesn't look at a map, that one has absolutely no notion of the shape of it at all. And I think that's what childhood was like for me. There was no need to know.
I agree entirely with what you say.
Bob mentioned sounds, and the most important sound about trams was the lack of sound. When a tram stopped, there was no noise.
It squeaked.
But it came to a stop, and even when it set off, and people could talk on trams, because even when it was going along, even when it was rattling, and occasionally trams used to get into a sort of speed wobble and throw themselves from side to side like dervishes, where you felt certain they must come off the track, but they never did. And the other thing that I remember, the oddness about the conversational thing, was that upstairs on a tram, in Birmingham at least, I think there were slimmer trams than anywhere else in the world. Upstairs there were 2 seats on the left-hand side and 1 seat on the right-hand side. And on Ribble buses in Liverpool, you used to go up and the conductor had to walk along a well on the left-hand side upstairs. Just imagine this in terms of the social...
Right-hand side.
No, left-hand side. He was on the right-hand side. Yes, he was, the conductor. Yes, he went up the stairs and he walked along the well on the right-hand side. And on his left there were seats spreading out. I mean, imagine the sort of like the social arrangements of this, which could contain 5 people.
Yes.
Stretched out, and you had to reach along those seats, and so you were always in that. I mean, mean,
I always thought the smell of the exhaust from those Ribble buses smelt different from any other whatever. You see, because I shared your experience of the trams a little, and then the trolley buses when I came to what I'm afraid I always thought was the more civilised end of the world. I thought the experience in a tram car was sharp, whereas when you went in a trolley bus, everything had bevelled edges. I don't really mean that the seats are... I mean the feeling of the whole thing was of bevelled edges, and that it went between recreation grounds and cricket grounds, whereas you got on one of those trams in Liverpool and it swayed along like a ship at sea, and you passed great black sooty back-to-back houses and brick fields and women in shawls and men clustered outside of pubs on every single corner.
People always think that everything is was all quiet in the lovely past days. In fact, it's getting quieter and quieter now. 40, 50 years ago, there was much, much more noise in the cities. And in fact, people couldn't put up Piccadilly Circus, evidently. People had to walk around with their hands in their ears. It was so noisy, particularly
in the time of horse transport.
Yes, and even up to the war. It was terribly noisy. They had to put straw on the roads in Belsize Park in 1938 when people were ill.
It was also very much dirtier. I know people always say that people throw more litter now, but I remember I was evacuated like you to America during the war and came back when I was about 6, and remember getting out of whatever the conveyance was that had taken us into the middle of London and stepping onto a sort of carpet of bus tickets, which were little squares of different coloured cardboard in those days, and walking along shuffling my feet in them in the same way that one shuffled one's feet in autumn leaves. And this is what the pavements of London were like then, and went on being like for a long,
Jane,
long time.
You mentioned another rich seam we might mind. The tickets, in very early days when I was about 5 years old, you were given as a present a bus conductor's outfit. And then you had little stiff tickets made out of cardboard, and you'd put it in a puncher that you hung round your neck, pressed a button, it went ting-a-ling. But really, in comparatively modern times, as Miss Dorothy Whitelock used to say, referring to the 8th century, in comparatively modern times, on the trolley buses, you had, the conductor was provided with a sort of printing machine that he turned the handle of, and a roll of paper came out, and it was just printed on. And I remember schoolboys used to ask him if he had any spare rolls of that, because you could throw it about and use it as confetti.
Schoolgirls did too.
You talked about going back to that place and seeing that, was it the 60 what when you got
604?
The 604, and I started looking at the tickets there just to check the tram tickets and to remind myself of that sort of outward and inward journey, and the thing that you read over and over again about sort of, the bylaws and regulations and not transferable because you didn't have anything else to read on the thing. And then, of course, I remembered what we used to do with the tickets was to count up the digits to see whether they added up to 21, because if they added up to 21, it meant, and so on, that if you presented it to a woman, then she was yours. I didn't quite know what to do with, but I mean, we'd learned how to count to 21 before we knew what to do with it and so on. And there, the only numbered tram ticket in the museum that I could find, I added up the numbers, and it came to 21.
Well, they obviously they'd done that quite carefully. But since I do bridge the two cultures, I speak of Liverpool and the London suburbs, I've spoken of it before, but let me remind you of it. There was a different response. The trolley bus response, if sometimes the conductor would change the what do you call, the destination board at the front, turn a handle, and people on a trolley bus would say, oh, dash it, or bother, wow, damn it, what an inconvenience. I was on a Liverpool tram years and years ago when that happened, and I was sitting next to a snouty little Irishman, and he didn't say anything like that at all. What he said was something much deeper, more primal. He said, more trickery. Jesus!
Jessica Mann, Peter Isaac, Milton Schulman and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.